Greetings! In this lesson, we will develop the skills for brick building. We'll begin by modeling a peg, and then we'll be able to duplicate that peg to create any sized brick or plate. The difference between a brick and a plate is simply the height. A brick is 4 point units high, whereas a plate is 1/3 at 1.6 units high. But the tools and the techniques and the workflow for building bricks and plates are identical. Simply the height is the difference. When we model our peg, we'll export that, and then we can use that as a starting point for building any sized brick or plate. Today we'll build a 1x1, 1x2, 2x2, and we'll end with this fairly common sized 2x4 brick. Now what we're looking at are various levels of detail for a 2x4 brick. And the reason that we have various levels of detail is because of the proximity to the camera. A model, a brick in this case, but any model generally speaking, should be modeled to the proximity to the camera. In other words, if a model or set of models is far away from the camera, it can be modeled more simply or to a lesser degree of fidelity or detail. Right? If we look at this here, this looks like perfectly two stacked bricks, but if we get nice and close, we can see that these are actually octagons and not circular. So it works if it's across the room or across the scene, but if we're going to get close, we need to have a higher resolution version, and we can see that here. In addition to the resolution or fidelity based on camera proximity, in terms of our brick building, we have to answer the question of whether or not we'll see the bottoms of the bricks. So you can see here we have some versions with no interior recess, and then we have versions that are modeled to a high degree of detail with the interior recess, the cylinders, and the indentations. This is probably the most common version that you would see or that you would use if you're viewing the underside. But of course, if you have a close-up, we would need to model to this level of detail. Now, because bricks are oftentimes stacked, you'll want to have a version, right? For instance, this version here has no pegs, has no interior indentation, renders very quickly, and lightens up your file load. Now, if we're going to be very close, but again, we're not seeing the bottom, we don't need to model that bottom. So this one here doesn't have an interior recess, nor does this one. But if you're going to see the underside, then of course you would need to model that. So several versions, and I'll make sure that when we come to a fork in the road, I'll remind you to save out a version. Now another word here, we're looking at various degrees of subdivision. This we would call a base model. So this is just a basic cube. It has no bevel, and it has no subdivision. It has not been smoothed or subdivided. So in terms of nomenclature or naming system convention, we would call this a base. We would call this a base as well, and it's unbeveled. Now the second one over in this particular row is beveled. So we could call this sub D0 or base plus a bevel. And then the third one out is subdivided. So we would call this sub D1. In other words, it has one level of subdivision and it is beveled. So in terms of our naming, we could just call this base and assume that it's unbeveled. We'll call this base beveled, and then we would call this sub D1 beveled. And we can see the three here. The only difference, I have this one out here just because it is a flat bottom. But I'm going to go ahead and delete that just as we talk about naming convention. Right, so here we have one with the pegs, and we would call this base. It has not been subdivided, and it has no bevel. This one has a bevel, but has not been subdivided. And then third one out, this has been subdivided and beveled. And then this one here, because we typically wouldn't use something that was unbeveled with this level of detail, these are the versions that have the underside modeled. So this one is beveled, but not subdivided, and then this one is, or subdivided once, and now this one has been subdivided twice. So the highest level of detail. Again, proximity to the camera and the question as to whether or not you're going to see the bottom. And let me just review that one more time. Base or sub D0, base sub D0 plus a bevel, and then this would be sub D1, subdivided once, and it also has a bevel. So those are the three general versions for this particular set of brick building assignments that you want to keep in mind. And you would want to save out each of these versions so that, again, when you're building a scene, you can import the brick that has the exact level of detail that you need for an efficient scene, efficient file size, and efficient render time. Okay, in the next section of the video, we'll build our peg and get started. Be right back. Welcome back. We're going to create our peg, which is the basis for all of our bricks and plates. We'll begin with a cylinder, and you want to make sure that it's on the y-axis, sitting straight up and down. So in order to check, we can come to Create Polyprimitive Cylinder, open the dialog box, and we'll just make sure that that is on the y-axis. We'll hit Create, and then in our channel box, we'll come to the inputs, and we'll change the subdivision axis from 20 to 8. Ultimately, when we subdivide, that will give us a nice circular shape, but in the meantime, we have fewer intersections to have to merge as we work on our box model. We'll come to the height, and we'll make this 0.8, and I'm going to click on the panel, hit the F key, and then we're going to come to the bottom. We'll right-click, and we're going to delete this bottom set of faces. So I'll click one, shift select around, right click to choose face, shift select it around, and then out of good habit, you know that we'll hit the 4 key just to make sure we didn't accidentally select anything on the other side. And a reminder, if we had, you can hold down the control key and make a bounding box selection to deselect whatever is contained within that bounding box selection while maintaining your other proper selection. So we've got these selected, and now we'll just hit the delete key. I'll hit the 5 key, and we can see that we've maintained the top, but we've deleted that bottom set of faces. We'll come over to the modeling toolkit, and we're about to extrude this bottom edge. So let's right-click, choose edge. We'll double-click to get the edge all the way around. I'll hit the 4 key so you can see we've just got that bottom edge with the deleted bottom half, or bottom set of faces, I should say, and we'll hit extrude. Now, we're going to extrude this out and form a square. And I'm just going to have you type in 0.5 on the local translate Z. That'll give us space for this next section of creating a square from this extrusion. And we're going to do this in the top view. We don't want to do it in this perspective view because the cylinder is not sitting on top of the grid. It's sitting in the middle. So we'll come to the top view. I'll hit the F key. We'll pull out a little bit. And then I'm just going to right-click and click off here for a moment. We're going to drag these vertices to form a square. So we just pulled this out half a unit on the Z. And we'll come and we'll choose vertex. And we'll do this one at a time. And I just want to remind you in terms of snapping, I always recommend for introductory students that they click on what they're snapping to, that they don't click and drag what they're snapping. And the reason is, because if I come and try to pull this, I might accidentally hit one of the arrows, and now I'm constrained. So if I was trying to snap here and I accidentally touch this arrow, now when I hold down the X key and click with my middle mouse button, I'm constrained on that Z axis. I could do it the other way. Maybe, right, we're seeing both colors. I'm free to snap on both the X and the Z. But I come and just what happens with introductory students, sometimes they go to grab it and they accidentally hit the arrow. And then you're trying to snap and you say, how come I can't snap to this arrow? And you've forgotten that you've constrained. So just a reminder, if you see yellow, you're constrained, and quite often you want to be constrained. But in this particular section, we want to be able to move freely. So we want to see the blue and the red. And so a better technique, at least a better technique for beginners, is don't touch the thing that you're snapping. Touch the thing that you're snapping to. So I've selected, let's click off. Right, let's start again. Got my object. I'll right click, choose this vertex. I'm not going to touch it. I'm going to hold down the X, and with my middle mouse button, I'm going to touch what I want to snap to. I'll come and do the same over here. We'll skip and we'll come back and do the middle ones. Right, so it's much less likely to make that constraining mistake if you hold down the X and click what you're snapping to. Now we'll come and do the middle ones. Easy to see the square this way. Selecting the vertex, X key, middle mouse button on the grid that you're snapping to. And now we have our peg sitting on a square plane. All right, now if I hit the 3 key, right, because we're eventually going to subdivide this, you see that we've got the nice circular shape that we're after, but the sides are too smooth. And if you look at a toy snappable brick, right, these are hard edges. So we will bevel the edge. I'm going to hit the Q key just to get out of the transform tool. And we'll right click and choose edge. We'll double click this top edge. I'll hit the 4 key just so you can see that. And then we'll shift double click this bottom edge. And I'll dolly there just so you can see. Maybe we'll hide the grid so you can see that. So we just got that top and bottom. And we'll come and we'll click on bevel. We'll hit bevel. And our fraction, and this is going to be true for most of the bevels that we do with our bricks, the fraction will be 0.2. That's, you can think of that as the size. And then segments is the number of additional edges. So we'll hit 2. And so now we've got that segment, or excuse me, I should say faces. We've got 2 segments or 2 faces, 2 additional. I'll right click to object mode and we'll hit the 5 key. And right, that doesn't look right, but right, we're eventually going to subdivide. So if I hit 3 as a subdivide preview, now we've got the shape that we're after. Circular in this direction while maintaining the hard edge in the vertical. Now before we save this out, we're going to clean this up a little bit. I'm going to come back and hit the 1 key. And we want to reposition the pivot. Every time we import this to start a new set of bricks, we want it to be sitting on the ground plane. But as you can see, right, here is our ground plane. And it's beneath, and because it's 0.8 units high, we really don't have anything to snap to. So we're going to reposition the pivot to the bottom, to that plane that we just created, and then that will allow us to grid snap it up onto the ground plane. You'll recall that repositioning the pivot, tapping the D key, and in this case we do want to constrain ourselves. So in this case I do want to touch that Y. So now the Y that was green, which means it can go in any direction, the Y arrow is now yellow, which indicates that we're constrained only on the Y. And now we can take advantage of that by holding down the V key, which is vertex or point snapping. And even though it's not on, we know that there's a vertex here. And because we're constrained on the Y, I can snap it to this vertex and it'll come straight down and be right in the middle where we want it. Let me just review to this point. I'm going to hit undo just to get back. So here we were at our start. I've tapped the D key. I'm sliding it up just to really activate that and allow you to see what we're doing. So I'm just straight up, and then I'm going to hold down the V key, which is vertex or point snapping. And with our middle mouse button, I'm snapping to this vertex, but while we're constrained, it comes down to the very bottom. And then we'll tap our D key to get out of that. Now we can grid snap up, and it's sitting exactly on the ground plane. And now every time we import it, it's exactly where we need it to be. The second thing that we're going to do is freeze the transform. So right now we see that it's sitting up 0.4 units. And when we want to move this or hide it or get it out of the way and then get it back exactly where we need it to be, it'd be easier just to type in 0 than to think of 0.4. So you'll recall that we can come to modify freeze transformations. And then that takes any values that you have in the channel box, zeroes them out, and makes this new position, transform, translate, rotate, and scale, all zeroed out, or scale at 1, I should say. So we'll hit freeze transformations, and you can see now that this is the new starting point. And if we've moved it and we ever need to get it back here, we can just put in all zeros. And then if we inadvertently scaled it for some reason, putting all those ones back. And then finally, before we export this, we're going to come to Edit, Delete by Type History. You can see several of our histories are listed here in our inputs. And so just to clean that up, we'll come to Edit, Delete by Type History. Note that I have it selected as an object. So in order to delete history, it has to be in object mode. You wouldn't want it in component mode. Wouldn't work. Edit, Delete by Type History. So here is our peg. We can see that when we subdivide it, it'll be nice and clean, but we'll leave it at 1. Has no history, has the pivot exactly at the bottom, so it's sitting on the ground plane, right? Nice clean transform, nice clean channel box, no history, pivot at the bottom, and we're ready to build our subsequent bricks and plates with this. Now, we want to export this. We would come to File, Export Selection, and it is selected as an object. And we'll just call this peg start, peg.start.ma. And don't ever save over that, and you'll be able to import that into any scene and use this as a starting point so that you don't have to rebuild this. And then finally, I would recommend that you go back and re-watch this section, re-execute this section of the video, because you should be able to create this peg, even though we'll be reusing it. You should be able to create this, and the techniques here, commit those to memory. All right, in the next section, we'll build our first brick. Be right back. Welcome back. In this section of the video, we'll create our first brick, a 1x1. We've got our peg start here, and just a quick review. We zeroed out the transformation so that we can always get it back to the origin sitting on top of the ground plane by putting in zeros here. We see that our inputs, our history has been deleted just to clean that up. We've named it peg start, and the pivot point is at the bottom so that it's sitting right on the grid. And then finally, we went to File, Export Selection, and we exported this, called it peg.start.ma. Now, as we begin, we don't want to start with this file. We want to create a new file. So we'll say File, New Scene. We don't need to save this because we've already exported it. Make sure that you export it before you get rid of this file. We'll say Don't Save. And then we want to import, and the reason we're importing it into a brand new file so that we don't accidentally save over it. So we'll say File, Import. We'll locate peg start. And then when you're importing, scroll down here on the right-hand side and make sure that Merge into Selected Namespace. That just means that when you import it, it doesn't also have the name. So Merge into Selected Namespace, it will give you the name that you created without the file name. So we'll hit Import, and it just says peg start here. All right, I'm going to hit the F key. Let's also turn on our wireframe unshaded. We're going to create a 1x1 cube, and then we'll combine the two and merge the vertices. We'll come to Create, or if your polyshelf's available to you, you can just create the new cube. We see here that it's created. Where is it? Well, hit the 4 key and you can see it's just small enough to fit within that peg. So we can see it here. Let's size it. We know that we're talking about 4 units on the width and length. So we'll say 4 on the X and 4 on the Z. So now that's fitting exactly, right? Exact shape. And then our height for a brick is 4.8. So that will be the size of our brick. If you were creating a plate, and you can come back and re-execute this if you need a small plate, we'll say 1.6. 1.6 is 1/3 of 4.8. And you can see here that's probably the smallest unit of our toy snappable items here is this 1x1 plate. But we'll go ahead and create a standard brick size, which is 4.8 high. So 4.8, 4. Now, if we take, I'm going to move this down a little bit. We'll hit the 5 key. I'm going to hide my grid, and we've got wireframe unshaded so that we can see, well, we're missing a position for vertex. When we combine, we also have to merge the vertices. And without an edge here, we won't have a vertice. So we would have a vertice with nothing to merge to. So we'll come back to our cube, and we'll give ourselves an additional edge loop on the width, and an additional edge loop on the depth. So now when we merge, or when we combine and then go to merge, we'll have a vertice to merge to. And this is a very fundamental modeling lesson, that when you're creating proper quadrilinear models, they have to have the same number of vertices so that when you combine, you can then also merge the vertices. Now, before we combine and merge, we want to get rid of this top set of faces because we're going to put this in the exact same position, but we're using this as the top face. So we want to get rid of this top face. We'll right-click, choose face, get into a position that makes it easy to select. Remember that whenever you're deleting faces, hit the 4 key. Make sure you don't have anything on the other side. If you had, you can control bounding box select to get rid of it. This is a good selection, and we'll hit delete. Now we want to put this in the exact same position. If we look in the side view, if we look in the side view, I don't have anything to grid snap to, so that's too far and that's not far enough. We could dial in the fraction here, but let's just reposition the pivot. So you know that repositioning the pivot, we'll tap the D key, and then in this case, we want to snap this up to be in line, and so we do want to constrain on the Y. So I'll constrain on the Y by clicking it, and now the Z and the X won't be affected, and then I can really cleanly, holding down the V key, remember that the V key is for snapping to a vertex or point, and we snap with our middle mouse button. So I'm holding down the V key, middle mouse button, clicking on this vertice, but because the Y was constrained, it was green, but when I touched it, it turned yellow, which meant it was constrained. I can hold down the V key, middle mouse button, snap here, and if you look, right, if I hadn't have constrained it on the Y, and I'd snapped to this vertice, which is what I did, the X and the Z would have been free to snap over here. But because I've got the Y constrained, the X and the Z are not available to me. Only the Y is. And so that's why I could touch here, but have it maintain its centralness and only snap up to this Y position. Let's go back. I'll just undo that and review that again. So we'll tap the D key. We're in standard mode here. I've got it selected as an object. We'll tap the D key, right? Get into reposition pivot mode. I want to constrain on the Y. I've selected it. It's now yellow. Hold down the V key and middle mouse button, snapped up. Tap the D key to get out of that. And now I can grid snap up, and they are fit together perfectly. And remember that we deleted those faces. So this will be the new top. Now, whenever we're combining polygonal meshes, it's a two-step process. We have to hit combine, which creates a singular mesh, and then we have to weld or merge the vertices that are overlapping. So two-step process. We've got peg start selected in Polycube 1. We'll come into the modeling toolkit, and we'll hit combine. I'm hitting combine there. And if you look at the outliner, you see you've got now what's labeled peg start 1, and we can move that, and it behaves as a singular object. But what is not apparent visually is that there are two vertices in each of these overlapping positions. And that is because our peg start had a set of vertices and our cube had a set of vertices. Combining made it a singular mesh, but it didn't automatically merge or weld those vertices together. And that's what we have to do as a second step. Now the good news is you might think intuitively that you have to go around and bounding box select each set and then merge or weld individually, or make that selection all the way around and then merge or weld once. And let me just review here what we're welding. If I click on that vertex and move it, right, you see that they were two vertices sitting in the same place. You can also tell that by hitting the 3 key, right, because those are not welded now. So we have to merge or weld these two separate vertices. Let me just show you again. If I pick that vertice, I can move it. There are just two vertices sitting in the same place. This was the vertice for peg start. This was the vertice for our cube. I'll undo that. You might think that you would have to select the pairs all the way around, but what we can do is just draw a bounding box around everything and come to Edit Mesh Merge. And you might say, well, why did we select everything? It just, as a ease, is the reason why. It just made it easy to just draw a bounding box selection. Because I've opened the dialog box here, the threshold is 0.01. So even though I have these other vertices selected, and I selected them just out of ease of drawing a big bounding box selection over everything, only the vertices that are within 0.01, that's the default, you can change that, and there are many instances when you need to change that. But we'll use the default here, it's 0.01, and those two vertices that are sitting on top of each other are within that range. They're 0, 0. They're not separated at all. They're in the exact same location. So they fall within the threshold. All of the other ones, even these ones here that are very close, are further away than 0.01, so they won't be affected at all. So we'll hit merge. These weren't affected because they're outside of the 0.01 range. These sets of two all the way around on the top now have been merged, and we can verify that by picking one and moving it. A moment ago when we did that, it came apart. Now, since we've merged it, they are one. Let me just undo that. And right there they are apart. Rather than kind of going around and making the selection like this, what I mentioned was we can just draw a bounding box, even though we have things that aren't going to be welded or merged. Selected, that's okay because they're outside of that 0.01 threshold. Now, I'm repeating this. We come to Edit Mesh, Merge. We can verify by just clicking on one and moving it, and they are not two separate vertices. It is a singular welded or merged vertice. All right, now we've come to a fork in the road here, and if you recall the introduction, we kind of had three columns of bricks. We had the base mesh, or the base model, also referred to as Sub-D0. Let me just review here. When we come to mesh smooth, we're doubling the number of edges and averaging the vertex positions. That is called a subdivision. So because this model has not been subdivided, and Maya used this function called smooth to subdivide. So if you hear me or anyone else talking about Maya use the term smooth or subdivide, it means the same thing. This model has not been smoothed, has not been subdivided, so we could call this Sub-D0. In other words, it has no subdivisions. If I selected it and smoothed it, this would now be called Sub-D1. So this object has been subdivided once. The number of edges has been doubled, and the vertex positions have been averaged. Now, in this case, we get our peg looking better, but the edges, right, or the vertices have been averaged, and this is not the shape that we're after. So I'm going to hit undo. This is why we would have to bevel these edges in the same way that we beveled the edges of the peg. So this first one, we would call it a base mesh or Sub-D0. Also, for our naming conventions of our particular bricks, it's unbeveled. So we might call this base unbeveled, or base, just assume that it's unbeveled, or you might see it as Sub-D0. Sub-D0 base model, not beveled or unbeveled. Now, why would we want to keep this one? There's two reasons we would want to keep this version. And we talked about that in the introduction. Because if it's across the scene, this is good enough. It's lightweight, it will save scene size, and it will make a faster render time. The more fidelity of an object, the longer it takes to render, longer it takes for shadows to be calculated, etc. So this is a nice lightweight 1x1 brick that you could use for a distant shot. The second reason you want to maintain a base unbeveled version is so that we can make a duplicate and combine this and create additional versions. So we could create a 1x2 by combining these two versions. So let's do that. What you would want to do is come and say File, Export, and you can begin to build a library of your bricks and plates. So again, the naming convention here, we could call this 1x1 base. And maybe when you use the term base, we'll assume that it's unbeveled. When we bevel it, we could call it base beveled. And then when we subdivide it, we could just call it Sub-D1, and we'll assume that the bevel is there. That's a little nebulous, a little bit confusing. Once we've created these and named them, it should be more clear. And or you can go back and look at the examples at the start of this video in the overview. So File, Export, Selection, this would be called base 1x1, and we'll assume that it's unbeveled. Now let's create another brick here. We'll come, if I was to duplicate this, and let's say we grid snapped it over, we'll just grid snap this. You can see we could combine this and merge this, and suddenly, voila, we have a 1x2. Now there's a couple things we should have done first before we duplicated it, because if we were to go inside, you can see whenever it flickers like that, that's an indication that there are faces in the same exact place. And we never want two faces in the same place. So let's just delete that new one. And we'll come and we'll delete these faces. Whenever you're deleting faces, hit the 4 key. Make sure you don't have something on the other side. If you had Control key, bounding box deselected, just select while maintaining your proper set of faces. We'll delete that. We'll hit the 5 key just to take a look at that shape. Right, so there it is. And we'll duplicate it. We'll come to Edit, Duplicate. We'll grid snap it over. Let's see, which direction is it? It's on the Z, so we'll say we'll grid snap it out here. And then we just need to rotate it around. We'll use the Rotate tool, and I'll hold down the J key, which gives us increments of 15. And that'll allow us to go 180. So now, if we zoom in here, right, we have a blank interior. A little bit hard to see there. Those blue lines are real dark on the screen. Sorry about that. But those faces, we could just separate it temporarily to see. We've got blanks. And anytime you're combining, and we went through this on the poly spaceship model, when we were combining the jet engine to the wing, right, we had to delete those faces that were intersecting each other. Now we can grab these two, and we can hit combine. We'll hit combine. And then likewise, we've got vertices, right? Two sets of vertices. Rather than making those selections, although this would be an easy bounding box selection, I'm just going to keep the workflow consistent. We'll have you grab the whole thing and then come to Edit Mesh, Merge. Now, if you were to click on one vertex and check, you move it, and those are welded together. And so very quickly, we have a 1x2. And you can continue to do this. So we could say, wow, let's make a 2x2, right? We could duplicate this, and if we were to grid snap it over, right? But we've got faces in there. If we come in and look, there are faces in the same place here. So before we do that, we could delete these faces. And before I proceed, right, you would want to save this. So what would we call this? Base 1x2. Assuming, right, it's not been beveled, it's unbeveled, and it has not been subdivided. So it's a base or sub D0, and whenever we use that term base or sub D0, we're going to assume that it's unbeveled. When you bevel a base or sub D0, then name it that. Call it base beveled. And then, of course, we'll have sub D1 beveled, and that'll be our third shape for a close-up. All right, so just kind of a quick review, and once you understand this, you can create any number of shapes. And this is one way. In the second half of the video, I'll show you another way. And in certain circumstances, one might make more sense for you than the other. But this is our first workflow for creating any number, any size bricks. So we'll duplicate this in object mode. Let's see which direction we're moving in. We're moving in the X direction. So we'll grid snap this out, and then we'll rotate it around, holding the J key. And you just want to verify, right? So this is sitting together, and you can see, right, those interior faces have been deleted. We'll select both of them. We'll hit combine. Workflow should be coming familiar to you. We've got vertices that are in the same place. So we'll just draw a bounding box around everything. We'll come to Edit Mesh, Merge. You can check. We can pick that vertex, and those have been welded together. And so here is a 2x2. You could save this out. Again, base 2x2. All right, so let's come to this point. We'll pause here, and then we'll come back and talk about beveling and subdividing for those second two categories. Be right back. Okay, welcome back. We've got our 1x1, 1x2, and 2x2. We've got those labeled here in our outliner. And I notice that we haven't deleted our history, so we'll do that now. We'll come and say delete all by type, global function, delete all by type history. We'll also set these on individual layers, and you should name them, but just for time's sake, I'm just going to create the layer unlabeled. So we'll hide that one, create a layer, hide that one, and then I'm going to duplicate. We really have a series of forks in the road because, as you'll recall, right, this works if it's at a distance. If it's going to be close, we have to subdivide it. If we hit the 3 key, we see a subdivision preview. And then this is the reason why we have to bevel those edges, so that it's hard when we subdivide. The other fork in the road is that if we're not going to see the bottom of the model, we don't need to create that interior recess. So we're going to reserve one of these. Now you've saved these out, you could re-import. I'm just going to duplicate one here and set it on a separate layer. So I've got this one. We're going to go through and bevel and subdivide this one without an interior recess. Then we'll come to this one, we'll create the interior recess, and we'll again bevel and subdivide. So we'll have a beveled version and a subdivided version with a flat bottom, and then we'll have a beveled and subdivided version with an interior recess. But we'll get to that in a moment, so I'm also going to set that on a layer and hide that away. So just to review, if this is far away, we can't really tell that peg is an octagon rather than a smooth cylinder. But of course, if we get close, the viewer would see that. If we wanted to do the subdivision to improve that cylinder, then we have the softening or averaging of the rest of the model. So we have to bevel these edges. We're going to right click, choose edge, and then we'll double click. That'll give us the top square. And then we'll have to shift double click the 4 on the bottom. And we'll hit the 4 key, and you can see those squares there. And just in terms of once the models get larger, selecting the proper edges, and especially when we have irregular, for instance, when we have angled bricks, making these selections and viewing them on YouTube can be a challenge from your perspective. So I try to label the selection. So top square, bottom square, and then we'll shift select the 4 corners. So that is right 4, 8, 12. We have 12 edges. And we'll come to the modeling toolkit and we'll hit bevel. Now the default 0.5 is too large. We want it, in this case, it'll be 0.1. And as the shapes change, we will need to change the fraction value. But for this 1x1, the fraction is 0.1. And then we will always, when beveling edges, use a segment of 2. That gives us 2 sets of additional faces. We'll right click to object, and then we'll hit the 5 key and we can see that. So here is the base beveled, right? So this is our number 2 column. A moment ago it was our base or sub D0. Now it is base or sub D0 beveled, base beveled, this version here. And we would want to save this version, right? Because this version can work kind of at the middle, gives us some options for other forks in the road. But I'm going to duplicate it, edit, duplicate, and let's subdivide this. So we'll come to mesh smooth. Recall that smooth in Maya is the same term as subdivide. Subdivide doubles the edges and averages the vertice positions. So we'll hit smooth. And now we have a version that can withstand an extreme close-up. You'll have a very nice version of the shape there. Here's our middle range one. And let's bring back our original one, right? So here they are in order. And we'll label those. So we could call this just base. We're assuming that when we use the term base or sub D0, that it is not beveled. We would call this base or sub D0 beveled. And then here we have sub D1, and we'll just assume that it was beveled. So distance, close-up, middle, And then of course these do not have those recesses. I'm going to hide this. Let's make another layer, and you should be labeling your layers here. Just for time's sake, I'm going to leave them generic. And let's create a version with the bottom interior. So I'm going to select the 4 bottom faces, hit the 4 key, make sure you have a clean selection, Control to deselect, and we will extrude. So we're going to extrude that bottom interior. Let's open our attribute editor, our modeling toolkit, and we'll hit extrude. Click on extrude with those 4 faces selected. And our offset is going to be 0.8. Let's just type that in. So we're giving ourselves an offset of 0.8, and we're going to extrude a second time. So we're hitting extrude a second time after that first extrusion was offset 0.8. We'll hit extrude. And now our local translate Z, you could scrub that to C, right? There it is going in the positive direction. Let's hit the 5 key. There it is in the negative direction. And we want to drive it up negative 0.4. Negative 4. Because you'll recall our total length of the cube was 4.8. Now we've extruded in 0.8, and we'll go up 4, that will leave 0.8. And if we see this in the side view in wireframe, you see that we have equal distance here. So right, this is 4.8 total. We extruded in 0.8 and then went up 4, which leaves that 0.8 there. And just for the record, I've arbitrarily placed this out here. It's not sitting on a grid, but that's okay. I mean, we could just grid snap it over to put it on the grid. So here is a version. What would we call this? 1x1 base. We're assuming base is unbeveled, doesn't have the bevel. And we've got this interior. Now this isn't something that we would save. It doesn't come up, because if it's at a distance, you really don't need the bottom. Maybe if you were using some simple versions and you wanted to see that recess. So this would be an option. I'm not going to save this, but we would call this 1x1 base a bottom recess, maybe, or some abbreviation of that. For us to use this, we would really want to bevel it. And then here, again, making these selections can be a challenge to see. So again, we'll double click this top square. We'll double click the bottom square. Let's start with squares. We'll double click the bottom interior square. And then we'll double click the interior top square. And we have to do that 4 times. Remember, the terminal one always has to be shift double clicked around, because it doesn't know which way it's going. So we'll hit the 4 key, and let's just look at our squares. Top exterior square, bottom exterior square, inner bottom square, and then top inner or recess square. So four squares, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now we'll get the corners. Shift select that corner, shift select this corner, shift select this corner, shift select this corner, right? Take a look at that. We'll come back, shift select the interior corner, shift select the interior corner 2, interior corner 3, I'm holding the shift key, interior corner 4, and then finally we have to get these diagonals. Shift click this diagonal, this diagonal, this diagonal, and this diagonal. Right? Hit the 4 key. You may need to rewind and watch that, but we got the 4 squares, the 4 external corners, the 4 internal corners, and then these 4 diagonals on the bottom. So I'll dolly around that slowly. May need to watch this section of the video a few times. And we'll bevel. We'll come and hit bevel. We'll make our fraction 0.1. Actually, let's see, and this might be, let's make it 0.2, excuse me. So we'll make this 0.2, and we'll make our segments 2. We'll right click to object mode. You can hit the 5 key to take a look at that. Right, that was the bottom, and you want to dolly around. If there's a mistake, you'll see, if you made a bad selection, you'll see it, And if you missed a selection, you will see it as you dolly around. Right? So here is our level 2, right? It is base beveled. So that's what we call it, base or sub D0 beveled. You would want to export this one out because this is one that you would use because it will withstand medium shots. Again, if you're rendering in Arnold, you can use that 3 preview and just render in Arnold. And then, of course, you can come and hit Mesh Smooth. And now we've got our sub D1, and we're assuming the bevel with our sub D1. And then, again, if you hit the 3 key, you've got a real nice shape. We'll turn off the, right? You've got a real nice hard shape with a circle. And this is the challenge for introductory modeling or for kind of first semester modeling. Having a continuous surface shape, everything is quads, everything is 4-sided, right? Even these tops that look triangular, if you count 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's a quadrilinear shape. Everything is quads, which means it subdivides nicely, UV maps nicely, and then, right, we've got a nice hard shape with a circular shape as well. So this would be our advanced version, our sub D0. Let's review this. You could pause here and yeah, let's go ahead and pause here and then we'll come back in the next section and I'll just review this on those additional shapes. Be right back. Greetings, welcome back. Let's work on this 2x2. Now a few things. I don't have this at the origin. I didn't zero out and I haven't repositioned the pivot, all the things that we did on the original shape or on the initial shape. So let's do that now. It'll make our life easier in the long run. So I want this pivot at the top. We'll tap the D key. We'll make that Y active. And then I'll hold down the V key and middle mouse button click. So now that it's on the top, and we'll tap the D key. I'll also put it back at the origin. So I've grid snapped it back. And then I have some various values in here. Let's go ahead and say modify freeze transformation. So I neglected to do that as I was making duplicates, having the pivot at the top, and then putting it at the origin and zeroing out or freezing the transformations so that I can always get it back here. Because before we proceed, let's go ahead and make a 2x4 using that exact same technique. And in the next video, I'll show you a different technique for creating larger bricks. It makes a little more sense for larger bricks to create to use this secondary technique where we import the peg start. Okay, I'm going to hit duplicate and I'm going to hide that duplicate away just so that I can come back to it. And we'll do. We know that we're going to attach this, so I don't think I have to demonstrate that we need to delete those faces. We'll take a look around, right? We're taking a look around. We'll hit delete. We'll select this as an object. We'll come to duplicate. And because the pivot's at the top, I can use this perspective view to grid snap out. That was one of the reasons we wanted that pivot at the top, so that we didn't have to jump into the orthographic view. Now the missing faces are there, so we'll turn them around. We'll hold down the J key and rotate that back. And just a reminder, right, we've got the blank faces facing each other. We'll select both objects and we'll come to Modeling Toolkit and we'll hit Combine. You'll recall that while it is a singular shape, these vertices, if we come and just pick one and then use the Move tool, right, we're pulling that out and we can see that they're not welded. We'll grab all of our vertices, even though only the ones in the middle are going to be affected, and we'll say Edit Mesh Merge. And then we'll right click, and you could verify that. You could click on just one, and now when you move it, you see that they're together. So here's our singular shape, and you would export this one, right? 2x4 base, or 2x4 sub D0. It hasn't been beveled, it hasn't been subdivided. but you have that option. And then having that saved away means you can make even larger versions from this brick. Now I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this one as well, and we'll do the two versions just on this. We'll make an interior recess version, and then we'll make a flat bottom version. So I'm going to come back to my channel box, make a new layer. You'll want to label those. I'm just leaving them as they are for now for time's sake. All right, so let's create our beveled version. So this is going to be one without a recess. So this would be one, if it was across and we weren't going to see the bottom, this is the piece we would use. Now selecting these edges is going to be a little bit of a chore, because on this top piece we have to go all the way around, and maybe it's easier in the 4 view to see. So I'm just shift selecting all the way around, getting the top rectangle. Remember, we'll think in terms of, and I inadvertently got that edge there, and just Control key to deselect. Remember, Control key deselects. So I've got the top rectangle. Let's skip the corners and we'll do the bottom rectangle. This allows us just 4 shift clicks, right? So we've got the 2 rectangles, and then because we don't have that interior recess or bottom recess, all that we have left are these corners. So we'll grab these corners, and we can hit the 5 key. I'm going to hide that grid, make it a little easier to see. Maybe the 4 key was easier. So we've got the top rectangle, the bottom rectangle, and the 4 corners. We'll come to the modeling toolkit. We'll hit bevel. We'll make this 0.2, and we'll make segments 2. And just like that, we've got a version that is ready to be subdivided. So this would be good if you were rendering in Arnold. You could hit the 3 key and Arnold would render it that way. If you were in Maya, or you wanted just what would be the equivalent of sub D2, we would come up to Mesh Smooth, and right in the 3 key you would see that. But before we do that, I'm going to undo back. Sorry, I should have reminded you, you want to export this one. So what is this? This is 2x4 base beveled, or we could assume that it's base because we're only saying beveled. This is 2x4, and all we've done to it is beveled the edges. Now if we smooth it, mesh smooth, now we would see sub D1 beveled. And this is a nice, right? This is a nice piece for being on the top of a close stack. You can't look at the bottom, right? But if this was the cap brick of a wall or a series of a stack, you've got a nice brick there. So I'm going to hide that away, and let's do it on a recess. So here is our 2x4, right? We didn't have that recess, so let's create that. We'll right click, we'll shift double click, shift double click, shift click, shift double click, shift click, shift double click. Hit the 4 key and you can see that you've got a clean selection. Another way to make that selection, right, the more faces you have, that probably wasn't the most practical way of making the selection. Let me just show you another way. We could right click to face, I'm going to click off, so we right click to face, I'll grab everything here. You say, well, we don't want those. But grabbing everything gave you all the bottoms, and then we can just use that Control key of deselecting. So that was much quicker than doing the shift double click. But in some instances, if you only have a few faces and it's an odd angle, the shift double click may work. But this, for this nice clean scene, we can just grab all those faces, including the ones we don't want, Control bounding box select, and now we've got that bottom set of faces. And we'll recall those numbers. We come to the modeling toolkit. We'll hit Extrude, and recall that the offset is 0.8, right? We'll hit 0.8. We extrude a second time, get that, and our is -4. Our local translate Z is -4, and you can scrub up to that or just click in the fields and manually type it. I'm going to right click to object mode, and we'll jump into the side view, and you can see with the wireframe, although because it's right on the grid, a little bit hard to see. Let's shift this over just a hair and you can see. So right there's the 0.8, And we've gone up 4, and there's another equal 0.8 because the overall length was 4.8, right? So we've got 0.8 here, 0.8 here, 4, and we've got the proper distances for this interior. You would want to save this one out, right? What would we call this? 2x4 base recess, right? We could just assume that recess refers to bottom recess. So we'd call this 2x4 base, right? Or 2x4 sub D0. Sub D0 and base mean the same thing, no subdivisions. And has not been beveled. We're assuming that when we see sub D0, if it doesn't say beveled, that it's not beveled. But in this case, we've got this base 2x4 with a recess. So 2x4 base recess, which is what you would export this as. Now, we'll go back and right, we can't subdivide this one until we've beveled it. So we'll double click, and maybe the 4 mode is easier to see. Double click, and we'll dolly around, get a better view. So I've got the top rectangle only. I didn't make any bad selections. If you had, control select them. We're going to skip the corners for now. Let's just do the rectangles first. We'll double click. We got all the way around. Shift double click that interior bottom. You get all the way around at once. And then like the top, we're going to have to go around. We'll double click, shift double click, shift double click, shift double click. And there we go. We've got it. So we've got the 4 rectangles. The top rectangle, the bottom outside rectangle, the bottom inside rectangle, and then the inside top rectangle. So we've got those 4 rectangles. Now we'll come back and we'll get the exterior corner. So I shift selected, shift selected, shift selected, shift selected. We'll come and we'll get the interior corners. And let's hit the 5 key so you can see that a little bit better. Shift select that corner, shift select that corner, shift select that corner, and shift select that corner. And then finally we have these diagonals. Shift select diagonal 2, shift select diagonal 3, shift select diagonal 4. So we've got the outside top rectangle, this bottom rectangle outside, interior bottom rectangle, the recessed top rectangle, the 4 corners of the inside, 4 corners of the outside, and then these little diagonals on the bottom. And the first time you do, it is when we're working in person in the lab, students are constantly having to undo because they've missed a selection or made an extra selection. So that is just par for the course to have to undo back or just reopen and remake your selection. Making selection mistakes for these ones, especially with the recesses, is very common. And in fact, look, I've missed one here. I was dollying around talking about missing one, and I've missed one. I missed that one right there. So we'll dolly around again. And I believe I got it. And it's when you hit the bevel, and we'll hit the point 2, and we'll hit the segments 2, and then we'll click on the panel, hit the 5 key. And here's where, when you dolly around, you can see if you've missed something or made a bad selection. So there it is. You would want to save this out, right? What would we call this? This is 2x4 beveled. We're assuming that it's base. 2x4, you could say 2x4 base beveled, 2x4 sub D0 beveled, or just 2x4 beveled, assume that it's base. And then you could either export that out or make a duplicate here and then smooth. This one we would just call 2x4 sub D1 recess. And this is going to be a very common one. Now you want to save this one in an upcoming lesson. We'll talk about creating the cylinders, the 3 cylinders that sit here. And then in an additional lesson beyond that, we'll create the little interior indentations that fit with the pegs here. But this is a great place to pause the video because if you've gotten to this point, you should be able to create any series of these basic bricks, again, with just a recess, not with those internal pieces. Okay, check Canvas for additional instructions on submitting. We'll do a brick build in which you can demonstrate your builds that just took place. All right, questions in the discussion forum, and look forward to it. Have a good one.